Well, ladies and gentlemen, the rumors on Resident Evil 9 has not been sparse as of 2024. To be honest, I don't think I could count them on my fingers and toes, but, realistically probably I could. Anyway, we do have this article from Gaming Bolt that reads Resident Evil 9 10 rumors you need to know. These potential details on the next Resident Evil are worth paying attention to. Now, these rumors were talked about in the past with no credible source, not that they have any credible source now, but the Residents of Evil channel has talked about it, so I assume there's probably some credibility behind it. Not only was a more credible leaker responsible for actually leaking it, but honestly, there are very believable points in here that I am very interested in seeing in the upcoming Resident Evil 9, as well as just seeing in general play out. Now let's get into this article by Gaming Bolt, but before we do, if you are new here, consider leaving me a subscribe. I would greatly appreciate it, and like the video to push us on out into that YouTube algorithm. So it says, the Resident Evil franchise has been on a rollover since it turned its fortunes around with Resident Evil 7 in 2017, having delivered a string of stellar all-time classic survival horror titles in the years since then. But with Resident Evil 8 Village, now well over 3 years old, fans are growing increasingly antsy about the series' next mainline number entry. And that's very true here, because man, with Resident Evil 8 Village, it's just aging very rapidly, and we are all intensely waiting for what could come next in the overall overarching story. It continues, and when Capcom will choose to announce it, the only thing that we officially know about Resident Evil 9 so far is that it's being helmed by Koshi Nakanishi, who directed Resident Evil 7. And with Monster Hunter Wilds clearly being Capcom's big focal point in 2025, it's looking unlikely that an official announcement and accompanying details for the next installment in its beloved horror franchise will arrive in the immediate future. That is a very interesting point I do want to make clear, because yes, it is undeniable that Capcom is going full force with Monster Hunter Wilds in 2025, which personally I don't mind. I mean, Monster Hunter is pretty cool. I have played Monster Hunter Worlds. It's a very interesting game. I did enjoy playing it, but I've got to say, man, Resident Evil is one of my I'd say top 3 favorite video game franchises of all time. But anyway, they continue. As ever though, there's no shortage of unofficial information out there. Over the last several months and years, leaks and rumors from a variety of sources have claimed different things about Resident Evil 9, and here we're going to take a look at a few that have caught our eye. Remember, however, that these are all unconfirmed and unverified details, which means there's no guarantees that they're going to be accurate. We certainly hope some in particular do, however, because they make some intriguing promises, starting with our first pick. Now, they did release a video here, and I did watch this just recently, and they did a very good job on numbering these rumors and talking about them in great detail. Not counting any remakes, it's been a while since we got a mainline Resident Evil game starring Leon, whose last chronological appearance was Resident Evil 6, and ever long since we saw Jill Valentine, who last appeared in Resident Evil 5, though her last playable appearance in a mainline entry was Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, all the way back in 1999. According to a recent leak by YouTube channel Residents of Evil, that's what I was talking about earlier, however, both characters are set to return as the primary protagonists of Resident Evil 9. The game is allegedly set 4 years after Resident Evil's Village's main story, which means it's several years before its epilogue. Additionally, interestingly enough, as per this leak, Leon and Jill won't be the only returning familiar characters. Yeah, so this I've always found a little odd, very stood out to me. I don't know if anyone else picked up on this, but I immediately did. So there was leaks saying, yes, Resident Evil 9 is going to take place 4 years after Resident Evil 8 Village's main campaign starring Ethan, not including the Shadows of Rose DLC starring, of course, Rose. And when you do the math, and I know it's pretty tough, but you do have Resident Evil 8 Village's campaign with Ethan taking place in 2021 because, as we know, all and or most of Resident Evil's main storyline games do take place in the year they have came out. Of course, not including remakes, because obviously, right? So yes, Resident Evil 8 Village's story took place in 2021, adding 4 to that, which is what the leak claimed. It would be 2025 that Resident Evil 9 would both release in and actually take place in. However, I do have a red flag whenever I think about that news. Well, not news, sorry, leak. And that is because there was playtests apparently in 2024. Apparently, I think it was September that people were given a Leon Kennedy playtest, and I don't remember the specific month, but it might have been April or something, where it was a Jill Valentine playtest in Resident Evil 9. But yeah, that stuck out to me because these people who have play tested this game or claim to have play tested this game, that would mean that somehow there had to have been a document, or one of those in-game documents rather, that clearly stated, oh, this takes place in 2025, Happy New Year, you know, stuff like that. Not literally stuff like that, but there has to be some lore text in one of the in-game documents that claim this is 2025. And I have a hard time believing that in a demo playtest that a playtester would play, that would be the first thing that people, well, not the first thing, but something very, very early that demo players could see. And that does, if that is the case, that does portray a very interesting way that Capcom is trying to portray this game to come out in 2025, which I don't think they would honestly do, because we know the patterns, we have pattern recognition, and that part does seem like something just fabricated, if you will. So that's something I don't believe. Obviously it could be true, I have no clue, but that one was always a red flag to me. Anyway, the article continues, Chris Redfield is and always has been a Resident Evil mainstay. You'd have to go all the way back to 2005's Resident Evil 4 for the last numbered installment that didn't feature him in any capacity. And as per Residents of Evil's leak, though he won't be the main protagonist in Resident Evil 9, he will play a role in the story. He will also be joined by fan-favorite character Barry Burton, whom we haven't seen since Revelations 2, and with both characters allegedly set to play a support role. Supposedly, Barry and Chris will be supporting Leon and Jill during their missions via radio calls. So this one's very interesting, so we have Barry and Chris apparently going to be featured in Resident Evil 9, playing a similar role to Ingrid Hunnigan in Resident Evil 4, and obviously its remake. I would actually very, very like to see the exact same mechanical things that we'd see in Resident Evil 4 remake with Barry and Chris. Say we have the radio call, then when we're playing as Leon and or Jill, we'll put our hand up to our ear, then in that little middle of the screen, but a little farther down in the middle, we'll have that little square that either Ingrid or Albert Wesker would appear, depending if you're playing the main campaign or the Separate Ways DLC, right? But instead, it'd be obviously Barry and Chris. And I do think Barry, actually no, I have no idea, like, who would contact who? They both, I mean, Chris makes sense to either contact both, but Barry morely would contact Jill, so I guess he'd be her Ingrid Hunnigan, and Chris would be Leon's Ingrid Hunnigan, I guess. But I did find this one interesting and quite believable, to be honest here. The article continues, Evelyn and the Mold have formed in the backbone of the Resident Evil 7 and Village story arc, and supposedly Resident Evil 9 is set to be the conclusion to that story. As per the leak, the game's story involves the shadowy organization that originally created Evelyn, now mass-producing her clones. To make matters worse, they're supposedly doing it by using the Immunomycete, provided by them, by Resident Evil 8 Village, by Big Bad Miranda. That can only mean trouble. So is it possible that the connections could have some form inside the Resident Evil 9 story. Will this be their great downfall? I do think that'd be interesting to see Leon and Jill like actually take down this organization. Obviously, Evelyn returning to 9 would be interesting. There are rumors that she will appear but only as hallucinations, so she won't be like a big boss character or anything like that. The mold also returning is also kind of interesting. I don't know what they mean by that. It could be like the mold did, or it could be just the mold in general, which I do believe that they are talking about, because the main enemy type has been mentioned as something else that wasn't molded that I think we're gonna get to later down in this article. But yeah, this all sounds very, very promising to me, and I would really like to see Resident Evil 9's story go down this way. I do have like my own vision for Resident Evil 9's overall story. This kind of would come in with it, and if it does match up with what I thought in my mind that one time, then I think I'd be very, very happy with this overall leak. But anyway, the article continues going on with Resident Evil fans are no strangers to locking horns with evil corporations and enigmatic organizations. And as we've touched on, Resident Evil 9 is supposedly going to make that part of its central conflict once more. Who is the central antagonist going to be, however? Supposedly, it's going to be a man named Mr. Simon, which I have heard about, and I'll speak on that a little after I read this article, who is in charge of the mass production of bioweapons for the company on the island. This is a franchise that has traditionally boasted strong villains, though its track record in that department has been a bit spottier ever since the death of Albert Wesker all those years ago. So it could be interesting to see how this Mr. Simon fellow pans out, assuming of course that this leak proves accurate. Yes, there has been a character named Mr. Simon supposedly leaked as the main antagonist for Resident Evil 9. This one, I mean, I can see it, but I don't believe it, because the name is just so basic, I always say. Very, very basic. In Resident Evil, we've always had really, really cool names. We'd had, Leon Kennedy, Chris Redfield, Ethan Winters, but even going to the bad guys, we'd have badass names like Nemesis, Albert Wesker, obviously, Mr. X, you know, stuff like that. The issue is, though, Mr. Simon sounds extraordinarily, stupidly similar to Derek Simmons, the main antagonist in Resident Evil 6. So either, like, if that is the case, Capcom totally forgot about Derek, and then they just used a name similar because they forgot they had an actual character named Derek Simmons earlier. Like, this one just sounds very, very fake and unbelievable to me. But who knows, maybe Mr. Simon will be this crazy guy, you know, who's really, really cool and good at his evil-doing deeds. I would hope so, but just the name doesn't strike fear at all. Mr. Simon does sound like a businessman on his way to work every day of the week. And I do like how the article does talk about Albert Wesker. I always had an idea that maybe Albert Wesker didn't die in the volcano, and maybe he come back to the, well, not come back, but like try to rule with his Ouroboros once again all these years in the future, but instead of using Africa as his test bed, he instead uses the small island similar to Singapore instead. Like, he's just trying to do that all over again with something else. Maybe not Ouroboros, but with whatever he found in maybe the mold, for example. Like, just using this Singapore-like island as a test bed instead. That's what I always thought. Like, he came back and all scars and whatnot. But yeah, that obviously that shouldn't be the case unless Resident Evil 5 Remake does portray Albert surviving that and Resident Evil 9 comes out afterwards. But I don't think that's going to be the case. The article does continue, from Mr. X and Nemesis to good old Jack Baker. Resident Evil games have delivered some of the best and most terrifying stalker enemies the survival horror genre has ever seen. And as per Residents of Evil's leak, Resident Evil 9 will follow suit. Supposedly, both Leon and Jill will have unique stalker foes pursuing them throughout the game. The leak is light on the details in this area, but claims the enemy pursuing Jill will be called the Goat Man, which is a descriptive name if nothing else. This is I mean, it's pretty interesting. The Goat Man. I honestly don't know what to think about it because we do have the playtests apparently where Jill's playtest took place in a hospital, which I kind of didn't believe at first because I first saw that on a random person's Reddit post that obviously had no credibility, and it started off like, dude, don't, I know no one will believe me, but like it's super true, you know, stuff like that. But it just sounded like a rewrite of Resident Evil 3 remakes hospital area. But then this other leaker with more notable notoriety comes out and says a similar sentiment. Then I was like, oh, that person had a point all those months ago. But the Goat Man is interesting because Leon's playtest apparently took place in a dark forest, where I would feel like a Goat Man would be more, you know, the setting just matches up with more of the Goat Man. But to be honest, it doesn't really matter because Leon has his own stalker-like enemy apparently, and you know, these stalkers were made for, you know, both characters, just like how Nemesis was kind of created for Jill. They're like the most iconic duo, frenemies, if you will. But yeah, I do think the Goat Man does sound interesting, and seeing the Resident Evil 4 remake designs with like the animal skulls and stuff like that, I do think they could really make a really badass design for what they would call the Goat Man. And the Goat Man would sound like he'd have some interesting mechanics separating from Mr. X and Nemesis and even Jack Baker. I do think that the Goat Man would probably have more of a mechanic similar to Jack Baker, but obviously it has to be more a little modern, to like where it's not just Jack popping out, punching and stomping on people and whatnot. He has to actually be following us similar to Mr. X and Nemesis. I would actually like the Goat Man to be a little more like Nemesis, like running after us and stuff. Maybe setting some traps would be interesting too. I would actually like the Goat Man to be Resident Evil 3 Nemesis's Nemesis. Well, there's a lot of Nemesises there, but in like more of the original Nemesis's mechanics rather than the remake Nemesis's mechanics, if you know what I mean. But anyway, the article does go on ahead and continue. Another interesting claim the leak makes is that zombies, or foes similar enough to zombies, will return as the main enemy type in Resident Evil 9. The island's residents will supposedly be infected with the mutamycete, which will turn them into ravenous zombie-like creatures, with behaviors ranging from praying to the moon to ravenously running after prey, on top of being able to use different weapons. If this turns out to be accurate, we're probably going to be looking at something taking cues from Resident Evil 4's Ganados once again. When I heard, I was like, this has to be the next thing. This has to be the next main enemy type for Resident Evil 9. It sounds so badass to me. So the moon apparently should be taking a bigger, well, not a bigger role, but like an actual role in Resident Evil 9. So when infected by the mutamycete, these, I guess, residents, if you will, of the island will turn into creatures. So it's kind of like normal human by day turns into crazy, scary, bloodthirsty creatures by night sort of situation, if you know what I mean. But by night, they'd be praying to the moon, like on a beach near the water, and ravenously running after prey. Like, that's where they turn into the enemy that Leon and Jill have to fight on the outside, and inside I guess too, but you know what I mean. And it also mentioned specifically being able to use different weapons. So the Ganados did use a few weapons. They've used like Molotovs, they've thrown things at you, they've used those not dart launchers, little arrow bolt thingies, and things along those lines. And seeing this article and this leak saying that they've used a bunch of weapons, I don't remember if this leak has claimed any specifics, if I recall. I don't remember. But if they have, I mean, I have no idea. This came out a while ago. But this also brings me forward to, what about Resident Evil 5 Remake? Because we've had the Magini use a big variety of weapons. They've used like wrenches, empty bottles, spears, and like these sharp knife-like things that aren't really knives. I don't even know what they're called. But seeing these sort of weapons maybe being talked about through these leaks is very interesting. Like, are they getting ready for the Resident Evil 5 remake and mechanics for the enemies to use weapons like those? And also, like, when they're talking about weapons, what about actual guns? Obviously, this leak doesn't talk about any sort of guns, but again, in Resident Evil 5 remake, they would be using guns a little later in the story, which is also very, very interesting to see. But anyway, the article does continue sticking with the leak we've been discussing thus far. It also claims that Leon and Jill's mission, we will see them heading to an island off to investigate the aforementioned company and its activities, though they too will be infected. Very interesting, and we'll have to deal with the hallucinations of Evelyn throughout the game. No, it won't be the first time Resident Evil will be doing an island setting, but it does sound like it's going to be fairly divisive, or diverse, a fairly diverse one. Speaking of which, this also won't be the first time the main protagonist wouldn't be infected with whatever the thing is going on in the respective video game title. We've had a Resident Evil 2 where Sherry, for example, gets infected. We have Resident Evil 4, for example, where Leon, Ashley, and Ada end up getting infected. We have obviously Ethan, who's been infected since day one, and I guess so on and so forth. But this is going to be interesting because how will Leon and Jill get infected with immunomycete? They've never had any visual contact with that because they have had nothing to do with the story of Resident Evil 7 and 8 Village. So that means they had to have been infected during the game. So I do want to see how that happens, and I am all for it. And obviously I do want to see them try to get rid of the mutamycete infection within. Similar to Resident Evil 4, where Leon and Ashley did uninfect the parasite inside them and got rid of it. So how would Leon and Jill do that, for example, on the island here? And of course, the hallucinations of Evelyn. This would be interesting to see their reactions too, because Leon and Jill have never met, heard, or seen Evelyn before. Only Chris, only Ethan, only Mia, Rose too, Chris's squad members and stuff like that, but these characters have never seen her before. I don't even believe they would have heard of her before. So what would their idea be of seeing Evelyn for the first time? Like, I do think that would be cool, because a big horror trope is actually like a little girl standing around with long hair kind of blocking her face, if you will, and then that like a long dress like thing, just similar to like The Ring, Sadako, you know? But like, would that be an interesting horror statement for these characters to go with? Because us as the player already know her, but these characters we play as don't. So how would they portray that? I'm very interested in seeing that as well. Anyway, the article does continue. As per the Residents of Evil leak, Resident Evil 9's island setting will feature a number of locations. It claims that the playtests over the past year have seen Jill exploring an abandoned forest and Leon making his way through wait a minute, I think they mistyped here. Yes, actually Jill, instead of forest here, it should be hospital. Jill exploring an abandoned hospital, and Leon making his way through a forest. This looks weird on, like, just on paper right here, it looks funny. Anyway, simple mistake. While other locations on the island supposedly include residents' houses, including several abandoned ones, caves, labs, a temple, and an abandoned factory. What does that say about the game size? Well, and then it goes on to talk about the open world elements, which we'll get to very, very soon. But we have the island setting talked about here from whatever leaker had leaked this, and honestly it does sound very, very, very promising to me. Obviously going with somewhat open world elements, this sounds super promising. Again, caves, labs, temples, abandoned factory, which does probably sound like where the mass production of the clones will be taking place, and maybe the final stage of the game, if you will. I do hope this game is long, maybe similar to Resident Evil 4 Remake's length, Or I would maybe even longer. I love long games, long single player games that are like perfect in every way. Cause like Resident Evil 4 Remake, in my opinion, is absolutely perfect from animation to voice acting. Like even the animation I could look at all day. Like just walking around the environments is fun to me. I don't even have to play. You know what I mean? But yes, apparently there have been Jill playtests in a not forest, a a hospital in Leon through a dark forest. And it says residences houses, which I would be very, very interested in seeing, because if that means we can go inside them, that'd be super cool, because we have had houses that we could go inside, like just random people's houses once in Resident Evil 3 Remake, for example. The orphanage was kind of one, I guess, from Resident Evil 2 Remake. And I guess the original too, of course. I mean both, but you know what I mean. And I guess the Baker residence is also a house, but I would really like to go inside of, random people's houses when the outbreak breaks out. And then like scavenge for medical supplies and maybe stuff like that, ammunition, everything like that. But then we have caves, labs, a temple, abandoned factory. A lot of this, not everything in this statement here, but a lot of it does sound like, again, Resident Evil 5, caves, labs, temple, abandoned factory, if you count what was in there as a factory. It could be, I have no idea. There was those like Jetson like floors, Jane getting me off this crazy thing kind of floors. I guess this is all Resident Evil 5 stuff here too. But yeah, this does also sound like it's getting ready for Resident Evil 5 Remake in the future, testing all these things once again in the new RE engine. How can we create caves? How can we create labs? How are we supposed to make the player navigate? So yeah, I do think all of this stuff does sound very, very cool when it comes to Resident Evil 9 and what it has for this potential open world element that the article continues saying. Many Resident Evil faithful will argue that the series should never go open world, and it's easy to see the merits of those arguments. Resident Evil 9, however, is supposedly going to feature at least some open world elements earlier in 2024. Prominent Resident Evil leaker Dusk Golem claimed that Resident Evil 9 will make use of open world tech that Capcom built into the RE engine for Dragon's Dogma 2. Does that mean the game will be open world? It doesn't sound like it. It does, however, sound like it might be a larger and more expansive experience than its predecessors. For me personally, and I know a lot of people would care about this element whether it is or isn't in the game, but me personally, I don't care either way. It'd be super cool, in my opinion, for, let's say, a full island, a full small island, Singapore-like, for Resident Evil 9's environment that we can go about our day, doing whatever we want, going into anyone's houses, checking out a bunch of secret locations. Was that what the caves meant earlier? Like, little secret locations that we can find cool collectibles in, and a good amount of loot, stuff like that. But I do understand where people are coming from when they are suggesting this will happen, because a lot of open world games can be very odd, especially when you're putting a Resident Evil brand over top of it. But hey, just imagine something like Sons of the Forest, but third person, using Leon and Jill, right? That takes place on a fairly sized island, I will say, and you're just surviving until you die. However, this one is habitant, and it'll be very, very interesting to see that as well. But yeah, Dragon's Dogma 2 does use the RE engine, which is also very funny. But yeah, that means there is open world utilage in the modern RE engine. Could it be used for Resident Evil 9? I would personally hope so. I would love at least a fairly sized island to run around on, surviving, thriving, looting, all this kind of stuff. And obviously, where will this big factory be? That probably will be the final boss area? Maybe on an island, a part of that island, maybe like the very, very end that we can't get to, because we probably need to get maybe the Goat Man, or that woman that Leon's chasing has probably the key to the gate, something like that. But anyway, the article does end off with longest RE dev cycle to date, which is very, very true actually. No game, certainly no AAA game, is cheap or easy to make. And sure enough, it goes without saying that Capcom tends to leave no stone unturned with the development of its Resident Evil games. With Resident Evil 9, however, it is supposedly going the extra mile, as per the aforementioned Dusk Golem. At different occasions over the last couple of years, the leaker has claimed that Resident Evil 9 has the longest ever development budget for a Resident Evil game to date, and by the time it releases, it will also have had the longest ever dev cycle for the franchise, having supposedly started back in 2018, which is very, very interesting. Capcom did go through an interesting phase, I will call it, where they were trying to release a Resident Evil title every year, which, I mean, it's cool. It's my favorite, one of my favorite franchises. I never get tired of it. Love it to pieces. However, I just don't think a yearly basis makes sense in the overall scheme of things, because we've had Resident Evil 2 remake in 2019, an absolute near masterpiece, and after that, it started getting, you know, cheap because they were trying to release something every year. We've had Resident Evil 3 remake, which it was visually cheap. We can see how cheap it was. If you've played the original, then you obviously can see how cheap it is. And then right after that, the next year, we've had Resident Evil 8 Village, which absolutely smelled cheap. I know I'm in a minority here, but I do think Resident Evil 8 Village smelled cheap. There's a lot of things that I don't like about it. A lot of things they took away from its predecessor, Resident Evil 7, that didn't appear in Resident Evil 8 Village. Like, just minor details that totally could have been there, but that game was cheap, so they did indeed take it out. However, Resident Evil 4 Remake is a masterpiece when it comes to minor details. Single minor detail you could think of was present in Resident Evil 4 Remake. Leon and Ada reacting to the weather, skimming their hand on a wall when they're walking by it, their shoulders kind of moving whenever you as the player push them into a wall when they're walking, stuff like that, breathing, all of that, everything, little hair movement. Any single minor detail you can think of is in Resident Evil 4 Remake, so I do want Resident Evil 9 to be exactly like that, paying attention to the minor details that fans would want to see, just like in Resident Evil 4 Remake, and some cool ass animations, all of that. But anyway, that is the more recent leaks we have gotten for Resident Evil 9. I obviously am very extraordinarily excited for this game. It's gonna be huge. I already know it, you already know it, and a lot of the leaks say as such. But you tell me your thoughts on this and all the points that we talked about today, sharing our beliefs and our opinions on all of these things, like the setting, location, characters, antagonists, story elements. You let me know your thoughts on all this. What is your big wish for Resident Evil 9? You tell me in the comment section below. But anyway guys, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, consider leaving me a subscribe. I would greatly appreciate it, and like the video. And with that in mind, I will most certainly hope to see you guys in the next video. Stay fresh.